Good morning, students. Welcome to my channel Exam Study. In my last video, we have discussed about the Charter Acts that were enacted during the company rule, and the time period was 1773 to 1858. So we all know British ruled India till 1947. So in this video, we will be discussing about the acts that were incorporated during the Crown rule. See, after the revolt of 80, revolt of 1857, it changes the political scenario for the Britishers in India. Britishers incorporated some changes in India after the revolt of 1857. See, this video is the part of the polity series. We are discussing about the historical background of Indian constitution. So these acts that were incorporated in the during the British era. They give us they gave the need for the leaders of the free India that we should have the constitution, and as a result uh, Indian constitution was enacted on 26 January 1950. So after the revolt of 1857, the first change that they incorporated was the act of 1858. And what was this act? The act of 1858, the main feature was the transfer of power to the British Crown. So this was the first feature of the Act of 1858, and also by this act ended the system of double government. Now, when the powers were transferred to the crown, what means the Her Majesty Queen was the one who will look after the matters of India. So they created a new post, Viceroy was direct representative of Britishers. So now Governor General has no role. Governor General was an obsolete, means there is no such position in after 1857. The Governor General was replaced. So that means Lord Canning, who was the Governor General during the time of 1857, was the first Viceroy of India. Apart from Viceroy, a new post was created. A new post, Secretary of State was created by the Act of 1858. So these were the features of the Act of 1858. After the Act of 1858, 3 years later, a new act was enacted known as the Indian Council Act. Indian Council Act of 1861. This was the act of 3 years later. So this was in pursuance with the after the Act of 1858. See, after the revolt of 1857, Britishers felt the necessity of seeking the cooperation of Indians, so that this type of situation which was in 1857 can be neglected or avoided. So they passed some acts in 1861, in 1892, and in 1909, that is known as Morley-Minto reforms, and we will be discussing about that reform later on in this video. So these were the acts, and now we will be discussing about the features of the Act of 1861. And now features are: it provided that Viceroy should nominate some Indian members to his legislative council. This was the feature of this act, and by pursuing this feature, the 3 Indians that were nominated with the Raja of Banaras, Maharaja of Patiala, and the third one was Sir Dinkar Rao. These 3 were the Indian members that were nominated to the Legislative Council. Next feature was it initiated the process of decentralization that was initiated after the Act of 1861. So it can also be a question, so you should note this point very well. Initiated the process of decentralization. Provided for the establishment of new legislative council for Bengal, Northwest, Frontier Province, This was the second one. And for Punjab. Now we will be discussing about the years in which their legislative council were established. 1862 in Bengal. So 1862, the next year of passing this act. The act was passed in 1861, and 1862 the legislative council for Bengal was established. In 1886 it was for Northwest Frontier Province. This was the region in the present Pakistan, and 1897 in Punjab. This act empowered Viceroy to make rules and orders for transaction. Okay, now you should have heard the word ordinance in the Indian Constitution. So ordinance was originated in the Indian Council Act 1861. Under this act, it empowered Viceroy to issue ordinance. And now who can issue ordinance? At present time, President can issue ordinance. Without that time, empowered Viceroy to issue ordinance without the concurrence of legislative council, and the life of such ordinance is of 6 months. At that time the life was of 6 months, and presently also the life is of 6 months in case of an ordinance. So this was the act of 1861. After 31 years another act was passed, and the act was Indian Council Act of 1892. What were the features of this act? It increased the number of members in central and provincial legislature. See, at that time states were not there, so there were province and there was the central government. So provincial legislature. Also increased. These are the two only features of the act of 1892. This is not so important act, but 1861 is very important because you may find the origination of the word ordinance there, and the act of 1858 is important. So increase the function of legislative council. Now another act was Indian Council Act of 19 1909. Now many of you will be you are many of you will be very strange that in 1909 Morley Minto reforms was passed. So why sir is teaching this Indian Council Act? See, Indian Council Act 1909 or Morley Minto reforms are the same thing, because Lord Lord Morley was the Secretary of State at that time. Remember, the secretary of the post of Secretary of State was established by the Act of 1858, and Lord Minto was the viceroy. By the name of Lord Minto, you should have heard the name of road in Delhi, Minto Road, viceroy of India. So these are the two. This act was important feature. The feature was it increase the size of legislative council. These are the some features, but the main feature is it introduced a communal representation for Muslims by accepting separate electorates for them. So this was the feature of Lord Morley Minto reforms. Also, for the first time, there was association of Indians with the executive council of viceroy, and this under this feature Satyendra Satyendra Prasad Sinha was the first Indian to be nominated to the executive council of viceroy. Okay, so after 1909 another act was passed 10 years later in 1919. That was the Government of India Act 1919. This is not a history class, this is in the series of polity. We are discussing about the historical background for the making of constitution, why the leaders felt the need that there should be a constitution for the country. There were some acts in the British era that led to the necessity that leaders felt for the necessity of the constitution. So that was the Government of India Act in 1919, that is also known as Chelmsford Reform. This act was enacted in 1919 but came into force in 1921, 2 years later. Why it was known as Montague-Chelmsford Reform? Because Lord Montague was the Secretary of State and Chelmsford was the Viceroy of that time. So that reform is known as the Morley-Minto Reform. This Morley-Minto Reform increased the communal representation. See, the Act of 1909, it increased the communal representation only for Muslims, but this extended the principle of communal representation by providing separate electorates to Sikh, Christian, Anglo-Indians and all. For the first time, central and provincial budgets were separated, and this provided for the appointment of a commission to inquire about the condition in India, and Simon Commission was incorporated in, and it visit India in 1927. However, there were no Indian members in it, so it was boycotted by the Indians. Now we will be discussing about government of India Act 1935. This was the act that provided for the establishment, we should say, provided for the settlement of a central bank that we know as that will be known as Reserve Bank of India. However, Reserve Bank of India was established on the basis of Hilton Committee, but the feature this was mentioned in the Government of India 1935 that there should be a central bank and provided for the establishment Public Service Commission and Joint Public Service Commission, for which all of you are preparing. So these were the features of Government of India Act of 1935. Bicameralism was introduced. Bicameralism was introduced. This was bicameralism was introduced by the Act of 1935. After that, the last act is Indian Independence Act 1947, by which it was decided that Britishers will leave India on a condition that the country would be divided into two parts, India and Pakistan. And after the independence, our own constitution was enacted on January 26, 1950. So these were the acts that were incorporated in the Crown Rule, that is after 1858. Thanks for watching and have a nice day.